The bitter Montana winter of 1876 showed no mercy as Beatrice Jameson trudged through knee-deep snow, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fully fall. She had trusted him, believed every honeyed word from Thomas Whitaker's lying mouth, and now she was alone, abandoned at her remote stagecoach stop with nothing but her trunk and the clothes on her back. "Come to Montana," he had written. "We'll be married by Christmas." Yet when the stagecoach arrived, there was no Thomas waiting, just a hastily scrawled note delivered by the station manager. "Found someone else. Don't bother coming to town." The stagecoach had already departed, continuing its route to Helena. The station, little more than a cabin with a lean-to stable, was closed for the night, the manager having ridden to his homestead 5 miles away. Beatrice had begged him to take her along, but he'd refused, claiming his wife wouldn't approve of a strange woman in their home. He'd promised to return in the morning. Beatrice huddled against her trunk as the snow began falling harder. The temperature dropped rapidly with the setting sun, and her city clothes from Boston offered little protection against the Montana elements. She sobbed quietly, drawing her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. The sound of hoofbeats barely registered through the howling wind. It wasn't until a tall shadow loomed over her that Beatrice looked up, blinking away frozen tears. "Madam." "You all right?" The deep voice belonged to a man atop a muscular chestnut horse. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a woolen scarf, but his concerned eyes were visible even in the fading light. Beatrice tried to speak, but her lips were nearly frozen. All she managed was a feeble shake of her head. Without hesitation, the stranger dismounted. In one fluid motion, he removed his heavy buffalo coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The warmth of it, still heated from his body, shocked her system. "Name's Xavier Larson," he said, crouching to her level. "Got a ranch about 3 miles north. Can't leave you out here to freeze." "Be Beatrice J. Jameson," she stuttered through chattering teeth. Xavier glanced at her trunk. "That yours?" When she nodded, he secured it to his saddle with practiced efficiency. Then, without warning, he scooped Beatrice into his arms as if she weighed nothing and lifted her onto his horse. "Hold tight," he instructed, mounting behind her and wrapping one strong arm around her waist. "Storm's getting worse. We need to ride fast." The journey passed in a blur of snowflakes and biting wind. Beatrice drifted between consciousness and a dangerous drowsiness that Xavier seemed to recognize. He kept talking to her, his voice a lifeline in the whiteness surrounding them. "Stay awake, Miss Jameson. Tell me where you're from." "Boston," she managed. "Boston? That's a long way. What brings a Boston lady to Montana territory?" The question brought fresh tears, though they froze before reaching her chin. "A man. A liar." Xavier's arm tightened slightly around her. "I see." The lights of a homestead finally appeared through the driving snow. As they approached, Beatrice could make out a substantial log house with smoke curling from the chimney, several outbuildings, and a large barn. Xavier guided his horse straight to the barn, dismounting quickly and helping Beatrice down. Inside, the barn was warm with the bodily heat of several horses and cattle. Xavier lifted Beatrice onto a hay bale and began rubbing her hands between his. "Need to get your circulation going before taking you to the house," he explained. "Sudden heat can be dangerous when you're this cold." His face was fully visible now, weathered but handsome, with a strong jaw partially covered by a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, she now saw, were a striking gray-blue like the sky after a storm. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered. "You saved my life." Xavier shook his head. "Any decent man would have done the same." The stagecoach manager didn't. A frown crossed Xavier's face. "Old man Peterson." "He left you out there alone," Beatrice nodded. "Said he'd come back tomorrow." "In this storm," Xavier's jaw tightened. "Man's a fool, could have invited you to wait in the station at least." He stood up. "Can you walk to the house now?" "My housekeeper, Mrs. Tillman, will get you sorted with dry clothes and something hot to eat." The main house was spacious for frontier standards, with a large central room dominated by a stone fireplace. Mrs. Tillman, a plump woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense manner, took one look at Beatrice and sprang into action. "Land's sakes, Mr. Larson, this girl's half frozen," she ushered Beatrice toward the fire. "Let's get these wet things off you." While Mrs. Tillman helped Beatrice change into a borrowed nightgown and thick woolen robe, Xavier disappeared to tend his horse and bring in Beatrice's trunk. By the time he returned, Beatrice was seated in a chair by the fire, a steaming mug of broth in her hands. "Miss Jameson will need the guest room, Mrs. Tillman," Xavier said, setting the trunk down. "And perhaps some hot bricks for the bed." "Already warming them, sir," Mrs. Tillman replied, bustling toward the kitchen. Xavier settled into a chair opposite Beatrice. "Feel up to telling me what happened? Might help me figure out how to assist you come morning." Beatrice stared into her broth, shame coloring her cheeks. "I came to marry a man named Thomas Whitaker. We'd been corresponding for 8 months after he placed an advertisement in the Boston Herald seeking a bride." She looked up, expecting judgment in Xavier's eyes, but found only attentive concern. "When I arrived, he'd left a note. He found someone else." Xavier's expression darkened. "Thomas Whitaker from Helena, you know him?" "Know of him." Xavier's mouth set in a grim line. "Has quite a reputation with the ladies, seems to make a sport of it." Fresh tears welled in Beatrice's eyes. "I sold everything to come here. My parents passed 2 years ago and I was working as a schoolteacher. I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought I was coming to a new life." Xavier leaned forward. "Miss Jameson, Montana territory may seem harsh, but it's full of honest folk who'd be appalled by how you've been treated. First thing tomorrow, I'll take you into town. We have a small school that's been without a teacher since Miss Pemberton married last autumn." Hope flickered within Beatrice. "You think they'd hire me? With your Boston education, they'd be fools not to." Xavier offered a small smile. "For tonight, though, you need rest." That night, tucked into a comfortable bed warmed with hot bricks, Beatrice fell into an exhausted sleep. She dreamed of the life she'd imagined with Thomas Whitaker, but in her dreams his face kept changing to that of a gray-eyed rancher with a gentle voice. Morning brought brilliant sunshine reflecting off endless white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape and temperatures cold enough to take your breath away. Beatrice awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon, her body aching but her mind clearer than it had been in months. Mrs. Tillman had laid out some clothes from Mr. Larson's sister, who visits occasionally, and helped Beatrice dress. The wool skirt and flannel blouse were plain but warm, a far cry from her fashionable but impractical Boston attire. Xavier was waiting in the main room reading a newspaper by the fire. He stood when she entered, his expression warming appreciatively. "Good morning, Miss Jameson. You look much recovered." "Thanks to your kindness," she replied. Over breakfast, Xavier explained his plan. "We'll ride into Silverdale after you've eaten. It's only 7 miles and I need supplies anyway. I sent one of my ranch hands ahead at first light to speak with Mayor Caldwell about the teaching position." "You did that for me." Beatrice was taken aback by his thoughtfulness. Xavier shrugged. "Seemed the practical thing to do." Silverdale proved to be a small but thriving town nestled in a valley. Unlike many frontier settlements Beatrice had passed through on her journey west, it had an air of permanence, brick buildings interspersed with wooden structures, wide streets laid out in a grid, and even a small church with a steeple. Xavier helped Beatrice down from his wagon in front of the mayor's office. "I'll see to my errands while you speak with Caldwell. Meet you at the hotel restaurant for lunch after." The mayor, a jovial man with an impressive mustache, welcomed Beatrice warmly. "Mr. Larson's man told me of your predicament, Miss Jameson. Disgraceful how that Whitaker fellow treated you." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "Word travels fast. Small towns," Mayor Caldwell said with a sympathetic smile, "but we've been desperate for a teacher. Our school has 15 children aged 6 to 16, all eager to learn." The position includes lodging a small but comfortable room attached to the schoolhouse and a modest salary. By the time she reunited with Xavier at the hotel restaurant, Beatrice was officially Silverdale's new teacher, set to begin the following Monday. Her step was lighter than it had been since leaving Boston. Xavier stood when she approached their table, pulling out her chair. "Judging by your expression, I'd say it went well. I start Monday," she confirmed with a smile. "Thank you for arranging it. You earned it on your own merit," he replied, signaling for the server. "I merely made an introduction." Over a hearty lunch, Beatrice learned more about Xavier Larson. He'd come to Montana Territory 10 years earlier, at 22, after serving in the Union Army during the final year of the Civil War. Through hard work and shrewd investments, he'd built the Circle L into one of the most prosperous ranches in the region. "No Mrs. Larson waiting at home?" Beatrice asked, immediately regretting the forwardness of her question. Xavier's expression grew distant. "There was someone once. She decided Montana winters weren't to her liking and returned east." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can't say I blame her. It takes a special kind of woman to thrive out here." After lunch, Xavier helped Beatrice secure temporary lodging at the hotel until the schoolhouse room could be prepared. "I've arranged for your trunk to be delivered," he told her, "and I've opened an account for you at Harmon's General Store. Whatever you need to get settled, just have it charged there." "Mr. Larson, I couldn't possibly consider it an advance on your salary," he interrupted. "The school board approved it." Beatrice suspected this wasn't entirely true, but she was too grateful to argue. "How can I ever repay your kindness? Teach those children well," he said simply. "That's payment enough." As Xavier prepared to leave, he hesitated. "I'll be back in town on Saturday for supplies. Perhaps I could call on you then, make sure you're settling in." "I'd like that very much," Beatrice replied, surprised by how genuinely she meant it. The next few days passed in a whirlwind as Beatrice settled into Silverdale. The people welcomed her warmly, eager for their children to benefit from her Eastern education. Mrs. Harmon at the general store took her under wing, introducing her to other townswomen and offering practical advice about frontier living. By the time Saturday arrived, Beatrice had moved into her quarters at the schoolhouse, a snug room with a bed, desk, small cookstove, and bookshelf. She'd spent hours organizing the classroom, reviewing the limited supply of textbooks, and preparing lesson plans. Xavier arrived promptly at noon, his wagon loaded with supplies. He'd shaved his beard and wore a clean shirt under his coat, his hair damp from what was clearly a recent washing. "Miss Jameson," he greeted her, hat in hand, "you're looking well. Silverdale agrees with you. Please call me Beatrice," she said. "And yes, everyone has been wonderfully kind. Then I insist you call me Xavier," he gestured to the wagon. "I brought something for you." A housewarming gift of sorts. In the back of his wagon, nestled among sacks of flour and other supplies, was a rocking chair. The wood gleamed with polish, the craftsmanship evident in every curve. "I noticed your quarters didn't have one," Xavier explained. "Every home needs a comfortable place to sit and read." Beatrice ran her hand over the smooth wood. "Did you make this? Winter evenings are long. I took up woodworking to pass the time." He looked almost embarrassed by her admiration. That evening, Xavier took Beatrice to dinner at the hotel restaurant again, where they lingered over coffee long after their meal was finished. He told her about his hopes for the ranch, his plans to expand his herd in the spring, his dream of someday breeding horses as well as cattle. Beatrice found herself sharing her own hopes not just for her teaching career, but for the life she'd imagined when coming west. A home of her own, perhaps children someday, a place where she belonged. "Thomas Whitaker may have done you a favor," Xavier said as he walked her back to the schoolhouse. "He's not worthy of a woman like you." In the lamplight outside her door, Beatrice found herself studying Xavier's face, the strength in his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the small scar near his left eyebrow that she'd noticed during dinner. "May I call on you again?" he asked softly. "Perhaps after church tomorrow." "I'd like that very much," she replied. Over the weeks that followed, Xavier became a regular visitor to Silverdale. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a jar of honey from his hives, a book he thought she might enjoy, once even a calico kitten from a litter born in his barn. "Every schoolhouse needs a cat," he'd said, handing over the tiny ball of fur that Beatrice promptly named Scholar. Beatrice thrived as Silverdale's teacher. The children were eager to learn, and the parents appreciated her dedication. She started an evening class twice a week for adults wanting to improve their reading and writing, which became unexpectedly popular. December arrived with plummeting temperatures and heavy snowfall. Xavier began to time his visits to coincide with the worst weather, always arriving with extra firewood and provisions just in case. "You needn't worry so much," Beatrice told him one evening as they sat by the schoolroom stove, playing chess. "I'm becoming quite the hardy frontierswoman." Xavier captured her bishop. "I have no doubt of that, but the first winter is always the hardest." He hesitated, then added, "I remember my first Montana winter, thought I might not survive it." "What kept you going?" she asked, studying the board. "Stubbornness, mostly," he admitted with a smile. "And the kindness of neighbors who checked on the greenhorn when they could have just let me freeze." As Christmas approached, the town organized a holiday celebration at the church. There would be a pageant performed by the schoolchildren, followed by a community supper and dance. "Will you attend?" Beatrice asked Xavier during one of his visits. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied. "Though I should warn you, I'm a terrible dancer." The night of the celebration brought clear skies and a full moon that turned the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Beatrice wore her best dress, a deep green wool that she'd saved from her Boston wardrobe with a cameo pendant at her throat. Xavier arrived at the schoolhouse to escort her, dressed in a suit that looked rarely worn but well made. He stared at her for a long moment before finding his voice. "You look beautiful, Beatrice." The pageant was a success, with even the most reluctant students performing their parts admirably. Afterward, the church basement was transformed for the supper and dance. Tables laden with food prepared by the townswomen, and a small band of local musicians tuning their instruments. Contrary to his warning, Xavier proved to be a capable dancer, guiding Beatrice through waltzes and reels with confidence. During a break in the music, he led her outside to the church steps, where the cold air was a relief after the warmth of the crowded basement. "I have something for you," Xavier said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He handed her a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of wildflowers. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a silver pendant in the shape of a book, small enough to be elegant rather than ostentatious. "Open it," Xavier urged. The pendant was a locket. Inside was a tiny, perfectly rendered sketch of the schoolhouse. "It's beautiful," Beatrice whispered, genuinely touched. "Did you draw this?" Xavier nodded. "Thought you might like a memento of your first Montana home. Will you help me put it on?" She handed him the necklace and turned, lifting her hair. His fingers were gentle as he fastened the clasp, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at the nape of her neck. When she turned back to face him, his expression was serious. "Beatrice, I know we haven't known each other long, but these past weeks..." He took a deep breath. "I find myself thinking about you constantly, your courage, your kindness, your determination." Beatrice felt her heart racing. "Xavier, I'm not asking for anything," he hurried to add. "Just wanted you to know that meeting you, finding you that day in the snow, it changed something for me." Under the winter stars, with Christmas music filtering through the church walls, Beatrice made a decision. She reached up and touched his cheek. "It changed something for me too." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepening with a warmth that belied the frigid air around them. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Beatrice Jameson." "I think I've already fallen, Xavier Larson." The remainder of winter passed in a haze of happiness. Xavier visited Silverdale twice weekly without fail, often staying overnight at the hotel rather than risking the journey back to his ranch in darkness. The town observed their courtship with approving smiles. Even Mrs. Harmon at the general store remarked that she'd never seen a better matched pair. In February, during a particularly bitter cold snap, Xavier arrived with more than his usual supplies. In his wagon, wrapped carefully in burlap, was a sapling. An apple tree, he explained to Beatrice's puzzled expression. Come spring, I thought we might plant it together. Takes years to bear fruit, but he hesitated. I'm hoping you might be around to see it happen. Are you asking me something, Xavier? He took her hands in his. Not yet, but soon if you're amenable. As March brought the first hints of thaw, Xavier's visits grew longer, often including discussions about the future. He spoke of additions he was building onto his ranch house, inquired about Beatrice's preferences in furniture and gardens, and once spent an entire evening sketching plans for a library that would properly house a teacher's book collection. On the first truly warm day in April, Xavier arrived in Silverdale driving not his usual wagon but a polished buggy pulled by two matching bay horses. He wore his best suit and carried a bouquet of wildflowers. I thought we might have a picnic, he suggested. Celebrate the arrival of spring. Beatrice, who had been cooped up all winter, readily agreed. They drove several miles outside town to a meadow just beginning to green, with a small stream running clear and cold with snowmelt. After spreading a blanket and unpacking a basket of food prepared by Mrs. Tillman, Xavier grew uncharacteristically quiet. He fidgeted with his coffee cup, started and abandoned several sentences, and finally stood abruptly. Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Puzzled, Beatrice followed him to a copse of trees at the edge of the meadow. There, partially hidden among the trunks, stood a small wooden structure, a miniature cabin, perfectly crafted down to tiny windows with real glass panes and a working door with iron hinges. What is this? Beatrice asked, delighted and confused. Xavier opened the tiny door. Inside, sitting on a miniature table, was a velvet ring box. I couldn't decide how to ask, he admitted, looking suddenly boyish in his nervousness. Then I remembered you saying once that you dreamed of a little cabin in the woods when you were a girl. He picked up the box and got down on one knee. Beatrice Jameson, finding you in that snowstorm was the greatest blessing of my life. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The ring inside the box was a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. It reminded me of your eyes, Xavier explained. Tears of joy filled those eyes as Beatrice nodded. Yes, Xavier, with all my heart, yes. They were married in June in Silverdale's church with the entire town in attendance. Mayor Caldwell performed the ceremony, and Mrs. Tillman cried openly throughout, claiming later that she'd known from the first day he brought that half-frozen girl home that they were meant for each other. Beatrice finished the school year before moving to the Circle L Ranch, where Xavier had indeed expanded the house, adding not just a library but a dedicated schoolroom where Beatrice could tutor neighboring children too distant from town to attend regularly. The apple sapling they planted together took root at the edge of the garden, growing stronger with each passing season. 5 years later, on a December evening much like the one when they first met, Beatrice and Xavier stood on their porch watching their 3-year-old daughter Eleanor and 1-year-old son James playing in the season's first snowfall under the watchful eye of Mrs. Tillman. Sometimes I think about that night, Xavier said, his arm around Beatrice's waist. What if I'd taken a different route home? What if I'd passed by earlier or later? Beatrice leaned into him, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their third child was growing. I believe we were meant to find each other, though I could have done without the frostbite risk. Xavier chuckled, pulling her closer. I'm just glad I had that coat, best investment I ever made. The coat, Beatrice raised an eyebrow. Well, that and this ranch, he amended. And the ring, of course, and the apple tree. And Beatrice silenced him with a kiss. I love you, Xavier Larson. And I love you, Beatrice Larson, from that first moment in the snow until my last breath. On their porch, with their children's laughter carrying through the crisp winter air, They watched the snow blanket their land in pristine white so similar to the night that had brought them together, yet now filled with the warmth of family and home and a love as vast as the Montana sky. Every December thereafter, Xavier would drape his coat around Beatrice's shoulders as they watched the first snowfall. A reminder of the night a broken heart had been mended by an act of kindness, and a lost soul had found her way home in the wilds of Montana territory.